I'm Barbara Serra. You're at the Listening Post. This week, Egyptians take to the streets in their millions, while the Mubarak government pulls the plug on media, old and new. WikiLeaks and the UK's Guardian newspaper, the battle is out in the open. Breaking the silence in Israel, giving voice to Israeli soldiers.
We were told there are no innocents. Everyone is enemy.
And Hosni Mubarak's TV address reinterpreted. Right from the very beginning, when protesters swarmed the streets of Cairo, Alexandria and Suez on the 25th of January, this story had the look and feel of a huge news event. Anti-Mubarak protesters numbered in their millions, and mobs accused of being sanctioned by the Egyptian government struck back. Media attention intensified, and the government's battle to control the message grew more desperate. The authorities pulled the plug on the country's internet. They shut down the phone service for a while and escalated attacks on journalists. Al Jazeera had its broadcasting license withdrawn, and our reporters were even held under arrest for their coverage of events. As anti-Mubarak demonstrators orchestrated one of the biggest political protests in recent Arab history, Egypt's online activists and reporters from the region and around the world resisted government crackdowns. The Listening Post's Salah Hadar reports now on a protest that came together online, dominated headlines and sent tremors all the way from Sana'a in Yemen to Washington, D.C. in the United States.
What we're seeing in Egypt is that there is a momentum now that is in all likelihood unstoppable.
Does this now mean that President Mubarak can't continue with people in the streets like this?
You know, people talk about televising the revolution. It's tweeting the revolution, Facebooking the revolution, videotaping the revolution, whatever we can.
Thousands of Egyptians poured into the streets across the country.
This is a very, very peculiar moment in media history, I think. I think this is a very revolutionary moment.
Of all the bizarre output broadcast by the Egyptian state channel, this was surely evidence of the disconnect between the Egyptian state and its people. Simultaneous with Nile TV's broadcast of this music video were transmissions from global satellite television showing footage of over 1 million Egyptians amassed in Cairo's Tahrir Square. The contrast between state TV and satellite broadcasters was stark, but not surprising.
When you look at the Egyptian state television, it's really, for many people, look at it a joke. You know, nobody takes that media seriously, and you see the huge contrast between the state media and the coverage from Al Jazeera and other satellite channels.
The Egyptian state television has turned to typical propagandistic broadcasting. There's virtually no information about the protest. So the Egyptians right now are subjected to two parallel media discourses. The first shows Egypt literally up in flames, and on the other hand, you've got footage of the Egyptian regime asserting their control of the country.
Asserting control isn't that easy anymore. The Arab media landscape is no longer the exclusive preserve of state-controlled outlets. The last 15 years have seen a lot of change.
You've had the satellite television revolution that allowed Arabs, you know, from Morocco all the way to Iraq to see what was happening in each other's countries. And then you had a kind of independent media revolution, which saw the birth of independent newspapers that were not affiliated to any political parties and obviously not the state. You've had the social media revolution, in which young people, the region is mostly young people, have taken to Facebook, Twitter, blogs, YouTube, all these new types of social media.
But with revolt on the streets escalating, the Mubarak government grew desperate for control of communications. At midnight on the 27th, the government disconnected Egypt from the World Wide Web.
The Egyptian government has stepped up its clampdown on the media and communication services.
Since the early morning hours of Friday, the internet has effectively been shut down in Egypt.
4 of the country's 5 main internet service providers were ordered to shut down all international connections to the web in Egypt. An estimated 93% of the country's networks were unreachable. It was one of the most extensive internet blackouts to date, but it came too late. When internet connections came back briefly on the 2nd of February, we managed to speak with Mohammed Salim, a Cairo-based lecturer. He talked to us about his 6 days in Egypt's internet vacuum.
I truly missed Facebook, I missed Twitter, I missed the internet, but there's something more powerful was being organized in the Egyptian street. In front of every apartment building, people, instead of communicating via webcam and via the internet and via Facebook, they were communicating face-to-face for the first time in 10 years.
We were getting information from our friends, from our colleagues, from journalists in Egypt who were on Twitter providing information. Their voices went dead when the internet cutoff happened. At that point, Al Jazeera became tremendously important because it became one of the few ways of seeing what was going on directly in Egypt.
The protests were the biggest story in the Arab region, and Al Jazeera ran with it. On the 30th of January, the clampdown came. Egypt's information minister withdrew the network's license and cancelled staff accreditations.
6 Al Jazeera news staff were arrested, then released the day after the authorities shut down the channel's operations.
The network continued broadcasting, and when it was bumped off Egyptian satellite provider Nilesat, other regional broadcasters carried the Al Jazeera signal into the country.
Like channels like NBN of Lebanon, Al Jadid of Lebanon, Al Mustaqilla, which is based in London, are broadcasting Al Jazeera for many of the Egyptians. Other channels are there. If you want to listen to it, use your remote control and tune to it. Nobody can force me in 2011 to watch whatever I don't want to watch.
They think that if you can just shut down the internet, if you can just shut down Al Jazeera or satellite television or shut down communication, basically, you can shut down anger. You cannot shut down people's anger at a dictator.
The clampdown on the network was one part of a wider campaign against the media.
Secret police, plainclothes police, obviously were targeting journalists. All ahead
BBC reporter Asad Sawi came on air in a blood-soaked shirt and spoke of the attacks against him. Journalists working with Al Arabiya, the New York Times, the Washington Post and Canada's Globe and Mail newspaper were arrested at least for a while. Local reporters were being pressured to toe the government line, and the deputy chief of Nile TV, Shahira Amin, publicly resigned, saying she couldn't be part of the propaganda effort anymore.
ويعلم الشعب الظروف العصيبة التي تحملت فيها المسؤولية.
If Mubarak's appearances on television were meant to calm Egyptians, his speechwriter didn't know it.
In a moment of complete chaos and virtual anarchy in the streets of downtown Cairo, here was the Egyptian president coming on air and not answering people's questions. I mean, their demands were unmet entirely. So it showed that there was almost a schizophrenia, a media schizophrenia.
If my President Mubarak, really loves and cares and respects his people, he would have spoken Tuesday, January the 25th. He would have made it very simple. I won't run again. I will do every single issue that the Egyptian people, the Egyptian youth have called for.
وعلى أرضه أموت وسيحكم التاريخ علي وعلى غيري.
What did he say? The only thing is he said that I will die on this land. I don't care where he dies. I'm caring that I want to save my people. It was a soap opera show orchestrated by the regime, by his presidency, by his cronies, by the people who are still supporting him in the military. It was a show.
But unlike events in Tunisia, this is a show still playing itself out on the streets of Egypt and on TV screens and social media the world over.
Here are our global village voices on the Egyptian protests, the media coverage, and the clampdown.
What we're seeing today in Egypt couldn't have happened 10 or 20 years ago. And the major difference today is the internet and new media, 24-hour TV stations as well. Today, anybody can be a reporter. Anybody can have access to a mass audience. The protesters in Egypt have really shown the power of social media in overcoming dictatorial regimes.
Despite attacks on the internet and journalists, Egyptians have figured out a way to communicate. And what I do think this crystallizes is that even under the most brutal and oppressive rule, people always manage a way to get the word out.
Other Arab leaders are looking at the situation, and if they're smart, they're understanding that their people want to be more than just subjects. They want to be citizens, and they see what it's like to be a citizen elsewhere in the world because they're so plugged in, they're wired, they have access to international broadcasting, internet, and they have a set of expectations about what their own government will do for them.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites, and we begin with a postscript to a story that we touched on last month coming out of Hungary. According to a leaked letter from the European Commission to the Hungarian government about new regulations on media in the country, the Vice President of the European Commission, Neelie Kroes, gave officials in Budapest 2 weeks to prove that the new law complies with EU standards. The legislation sparked protests in Hungary last month, and it lists fines as high as $1 million for coverage that's deemed imbalanced or immoral. There is also a concern that foreign media outlets operating in the country will be subjected to Hungarian media laws, which would contravene EU regulations. Ms. Kroes also expressed concern over the wording of the law and said that it was drafted in, quote, quite general terms, leaving large room for interpretation, unquote. While Hungary's Foreign Minister János Martonyi downplayed the EU's concerns and said that they could easily be overcome. Some media analysts have taken that as a sign that the Hungarian government is willing to make changes to the law in the face of global condemnation. You see, it does work sometimes. Whistleblowing website WikiLeaks seems to be getting a taste of its own medicine from the Norwegian daily Aftenposten. The paper has been releasing excerpts of the remaining leaked US diplomatic cables ahead of the publication dates agreed by WikiLeaks and its 5 print media collaborators. Ole Erik Almlid, Aftenposten's editor, refuses to reveal how the paper got hold of the cables, but he acknowledged that it took some work and they were obtained without WikiLeaks' consent. Aftenposten is not the only newspaper running afoul of WikiLeaks. 2 journalists from the UK's Guardian newspaper have published a book called WikiLeaks Inside Julian Assange's War on Secrecy. The Guardian, of course, is the newspaper credited with brokering the first deal for extensive collaboration between WikiLeaks and traditional mainstream media.
This is the first full-scale biography of Julian Assange.
Well, the book details the newspaper's dealings with Assange and details some of his quirky behavior, like disguising himself as an old woman because he feared he was being followed by US intelligence services. But what seems to have irked WikiLeaks the most is that the authors of the book definitively named Bradley Manning, that's the US soldier alleged to have leaked the classified US documents to WikiLeaks, as the source. And that's something Mr. Assange has repeatedly refused to do. The Guardian defended the move, saying that Mr. Manning had openly admitted to leaking the data to the website.
If the allegations against him are true, then he is the foremost prisoner of conscience in the United States.
Assange spoke about Manning last week when he appeared on the iconic American news program 60 Minutes, where he took a gamble in arguing WikiLeaks' case in the court of American public opinion. Video editors in TV news sometimes struggle to come up with appropriate pictures for their stories, but a Chinese network may have gone that bit too far. Take this news report, for instance. It aired on state-run Chinese Central Television, and according to the reporter, it showed a Chinese J-10 fighter plane in action, shooting down another aircraft during a practice exercise. But take a look at this shot. Anyone who knows their movies would see a distinct similarity between the explosion in the report and the mid-air explosion in the 1986 hit film Top Gun. A CCTV insider was quoted as saying that this was not the first time the network had used movie footage in one of its reports, and that it usually boiled down to either lazy editors or footage that was simply too good not to use. The media landscape in Israel is one of the most active and varied in the Middle East, but even there, aggressive journalism has its limits. Issues of national security are very sensitive, and Israeli journalists tread carefully when reporting on the military. But an organization called Breaking the Silence is living up to its name by literally breaking the media silence on the lives of Israeli soldiers in combat. They've gathered hundreds of testimonies from Israeli soldiers who have fought the country's wars and implemented the occupation of the West Bank. Many of the revelations have shocked the Israeli public, with allegations of abuse coming from inside the army for the first time. The Listening Post's Simon Ostrovsky now on the organization that's exposing the uncomfortable truths about the Israeli army and Israeli national security.
These are statements made by Israeli soldiers about their own service in the war on Gaza in 2009. For the last 6 years, a group of Israeli army veterans calling itself Breaking the Silence has been collecting testimonies from Israeli soldiers like these and handing them over to the media within Israel and abroad. It wants to shine a light on how Israel fights its wars and occupies the West Bank. Their efforts have been applauded by some, but the army they once took their orders from, and some in the Israeli media, call them dangerous radicals.
הארגון הזה, שמגבב גיבובים של עדויות אנונימיות, אי אפשר לבדוק את זה, הם יכולים לטעון מה שהם רוצים.
הטיעון הבסיסי הוא פה, שמדובר באנשים שהם פשוט לא מוסריים.
The entire world, including this group, including Al Jazeera, including The Guardian, including the BBC, are focusing on claims that are made.
So you're saying that absolutely everyone
Israelis.
is...
They feel that we're doing what we're doing not out of love for our country and our society, but with some kind of evil.
The effect of the revelations brought forward by Breaking the Silence, which has interviewed over 700 Israeli soldiers, has been explosive in the international media, with a number of foreign outlets running front-page stories on many of the group's allegations of abuse.
Breaking the Silence has posted new photos depicting abuse.
But how much influence has their work had on outlets they most care about, the media in Israel?
Unfortunately, the effect is limited. It is not well known in the Israeli society.
There is a sense amongst the Israelis that they're fed up with the kind of peace process, with the kind of news that they read in the papers, the kind of things they saw on TV, that nothing was really changing. Everything's kind of the same, so why even tune in?
I accompanied Breaking the Silence on a trip the group organizes every couple of weeks to the West Bank's second largest city, Hebron, to find out what they're doing to bring the occupation back to Israeli TV sets. Yehuda Shaul, who was once deployed here as a soldier, explains to visitors and journalists alike how Palestinians have been banned from the center of the city since a Jewish settlement was created in the heart of Hebron. Because of Breaking the Silence's anti-occupation stance, Jewish settlers here often harass the tours. But Shaul continued with the tour unfazed.
Now, everything we saw today and everything we're going to see today is being justified by the Israeli authorities for security purposes.
Here in Hebron, Breaking the Silence is making the argument that the occupation is a brutal and inhumane affair that's only prolonging the conflict. But the question is the Israeli media listening? I spoke to an editor of Israel's most popular English language daily to find out.
I mean, I monitor all the papers, all the radio stations, and all the TV stations and internet sites on a daily basis constantly. And I can tell you that Breaking the Silence, B'Tselem, Peace Now, when they come out with relevant information, they're covered widely by even the TV and radio outlets that are kind of partly owned or fully owned by the government. This is not a dictatorship. This is not North Korea. This is a free democracy with a very, very aggressive press.
But from Ramallah, the seat of the Palestinian Authority, the view on Israeli coverage was very different.
Unfortunately, these testimonies from such soldiers are being covered mainly in leftist newspapers in Israel and not in the mainstream media. But I should say that these testimonies have been publicized widely in foreign media.
Breaking the Silence made its biggest ever media splash with the release of 26 soldier testimonies a few months after the end of the war on Gaza.
We were told there are no innocents. Everyone is enemy.
But most of the attention came from publications based abroad.
In Israel, you can see the reaction to what we're doing, like the bad reaction, usually, and the criticism. He's saying that there is a feeling that breaking the silence or doing what they're doing out of evil. And around the world, you just see how, for example, Frankfurt Allgemein, which is one of the most important journals in Germany, are given the first front page for reporting about our testimonies from Gaza.
But members of Breaking the Silence say they've faced a bigger problem than hostility in the Israeli media. They accuse the Israeli army of launching a public relations counter-offensive challenging the group's motives by highlighting the fact that much of their funding comes from abroad.
Talking about the funding is kind of a way to shift the discussion from the main idea of it. And the main idea is what happened, is the facts on the ground, and this is what we're trying to promote.
The Israeli military has since changed tack.
The IDF doesn't care about the funding. The IDF cares about the principle behind the organization. And the principle here is taking care of the own interests of the organization, not of Israel's.
The army spokeswoman complained that the Israeli military couldn't act on allegations made in anonymous interviews to Breaking the Silence.
Instead of giving me hardcore, hard fact details, it does the opposite. It blurs the faces. It blurs the facts. I cannot investigate anything with this information I'm receiving.
On television, the front page, and on the web, the anonymous testimonies are a controversial issue. Many Israelis, including the soldier patrolling our tour of Hebron, aren't ready to break the silence on the occupation, at least not yet.
Would you give an interview to Breaking the Silence?
I am not agree with Breaking the Silence.
Really? Can you tell me about it?
Not now.
No? When?
When I am not being the army.
More Global Village voices now on Breaking the Silence.
There are no other NGOs in Israel that are working on the ground with Israeli army veterans, interviewing them about their experiences, recording them, and publicizing them. Were it not for the group, we wouldn't know half the serious human rights violations that occurred during Operation Cast Lead. It is the eyes and ears of Israeli democracy.
It's these kinds of actions and these kinds of groups that will save Israel from itself, because no amount of military might ultimately can withstand the moral force of a people who are seeking freedom and seeking justice. As a matter of fact, we're witnessing the spectacular truth in that statement unfold before our eyes in Egypt.
Finally, the art of public speaking is an important one for heads of state, especially in times of crisis. When President Mubarak appeared on state-run TV in an attempt to diffuse the anger of Egyptians on the streets, well, his words fell a little flat. If you missed it, don't worry. The animators at Jordan-based Karabish Studios created their own version of the speech that imagines Mubarak making a more candid concession speech. It's our web video of the week. Enjoy it, and we'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
أخلع مخلع أخلع مخلع أخلع مخلعش يخرب بيتك يا زين يا ابن علي الله يحرقك أصلح إيه ولا إيه جاتكوا القرف أما أقوم دلوقتي أخطب بالشعب جايز ربنا يهديهم أيها الشعب الكريم لقد تابعت الماتش قصد التظاهرات ولقد رعبتوني قوي ليه العنف ده؟ ما تخلونا حبايب بقى مع بعض. احنا هنصلح. هنجيب السباك والنجار ونشطب الحكومة دورين وكل حاجة هتبقى في السليم، مفيش مشكلة ان شاء الله. انا هضل دايما في خلقتكم. ولو مش عاوزيني انا عاوزكم. وفي الحقيقة انا لقيت الحل. ايه رأيكم؟